Hello and welcome to the Third Sector Podcast. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. I'm Andy Ricketts, and joining us in the studio today is Matt Hyde, Chief Executive of the Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales. Matt has been at the Grantmaker for almost 2 years, having previously led the Scouts and before that the National Union of Students. He's a co-founder of the Big Help Out volunteering initiative, Vice Chair of Comic Relief and a member of the Civil Society Council, the body that works with the government on the implementation of the Civil Society Covenant. Matt, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here in Third Sector headquarters.
Indeed. Now, at the Lloyds Bank Foundation, you've recently launched a new strategy called In a Good Place. Can you talk a little bit about what that means in practice in terms of how you're going to be funding charities differently?
Sure. Well, Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales has been around for just over 40 years. And I think has established a reputation over that period of being a progressive funder that focuses on unrestricted funding, which is so critical for charities, particularly small charities where we've historically funded, multi-year funding, and the relational support that you get as a funder from Lloyds Bank Foundation. So how we establish relationships with people when we fund, how we really get to understand them, but particularly the funder plus element. And what I mean by that is the organizational development support. If you want a strategy consultant, you want a mentor or coaches or a CRM system, in addition to the funding, you get all the power and the benefit of that. And we produced a report from Charizone earlier in the year that shows that the result of that is you can nearly double the growth of an organization because of that blend of unrestricted funding, multi-year, plus the capacity building support you get as well. So we're going to take all of that with us because I think it sets us apart and we know it can make a bigger impact. The new strategy is very much focused on connecting and catalyzing community-led change. Again, that's something we've done throughout our history. So the catalyzing bit, we were at the start of brands like Childline or Changing Faces. And the connecting bit's always been important, particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, we've been doing more on place-based systems change. So that's our focus going forward. That's our mission. But what we're aiming for is to ensure that everyone in England and Wales is in a good place, that they're personally in a good place, that their home's a good place to live, and that their community is a good place to belong to. So they're the 3 pillars that we believe, based on consultation we did, lots of research we did, that really help you to ensure that you're in a good place. And we're going to be assessing that by using something called the Good Place Index, which is looking at 5 different outcomes around well-being, agency, resilience, trusted relationships and opportunities. Because if you get all of those things, then you're going to be more likely to be in a good place. And we're assessing that in terms of how we focus, where we fund going forward. And really what we want to do is we're an independent charitable foundation. So we're funded by the profits of Lloyds Banking Group. But of course, we're an independent charity that has our own focus. But we feel that we can go further to leverage that relationship. So whilst we're going to be separate, there's a huge opportunity here to use the assets of the biggest retail bank in the country across these brands, from Lloyds to Scottish Widows to Cazenove, Bank of Scotland, which is more relevant to our sister foundation. But we think we can do more to leverage more giving, both in terms of funding, philanthropy, and also in terms of volunteering as well, which of course we've done employer supported volunteering. And we think we can go even further. And that's at the heart of the new strategy.
So in terms of that growing giving aspect, that is one of the things that's set out in the strategy. How do you propose to do that?
So in relation to philanthropy, we think there is an opportunity to explore with the bank how, where you've got people with wealth who want to make a bigger impact and they want to give more, but they don't know how to do it in a way that is really impactful, we think we can open up doors there when there is so much need. Less people giving over the last 10 years, both in terms of philanthropy and in terms of volunteering. And then we're also keen to have conversations with the bank. In fact, we're in the middle of these at the moment about when you've got 28 million people on an app, how can we make it easier for those people to give money? How can we make it easier to identify the organizations within a locality, within a place, where we can have done the due diligence and it make it easier for them to give money to those organizations? I mean, we're a funder, we're a conduit at the end of the day. We're not the kind of final destination. The final destination are community-led organizations, small charities, KICs, CIOs across the country who are making the difference to people's lives and are so essential. And we already do match giving with employees as well. So if they fundraise up to £500, then we'll match that up to that amount as well. And then on the volunteering side, again, how can we open up opportunities with 28 million customers? But how do we also ensure that staff in Lloyds Banking Group are able to make their own personal impact, use their skills in a way that's good for them and good for the business in terms of productivity? And we know, like, all sorts of people, Pro Bono Economics, Pilot Light, loads have written about this over the years in terms of the power of employees giving in their community and giving time to them as an individual, to the business, but also ultimately to community-led organisations as well. And the bank has their own purpose around helping Britain prosper. So bringing that alongside us wanting to ensure that everyone's in a good place, we think is a powerful combination.
So are there levers that you can pull as a funder that will help increase high net worth giving from major philanthropists and rich individuals in the UK?
Well, I think starting with opening doors to relationships, to have conversations about what we do. But I think in the same way you might look at an investment portfolio, we're investing in a portfolio of charities, community-led organisations across the country, and able to demonstrate the impact that those organisations are having as well. And so actually what we're doing is being a route through which you can both give, but give impactfully. And we're particularly obviously interested in those three pillars of personal resilience. What do we mean by that? Okay, so financial resilience and digital inclusion are going to be two themes that sit within that. When it comes to housing and homelessness prevention, and we've just launched our In a Good Place New Beginnings Fund, but also non-profit housing. And what could that look like if you're a charity who wants to open up your housing supply when there's so much need across the country? And we've had this conversation with lots of different organisations. And then thirdly, community belonging and investing in anchor organisations that bring people together across divides. So you take those three themes and then you go to philanthropists and you say, we think we can open up an opportunity for you to use the prize of bringing more capital to place and make a bigger difference. And that could be working with other foundations as well. And we hope to say more about that later in the year.
One of the things that the new strategy talks about is the fact that you want to focus on 100 areas across England and Wales. How have you identified those areas, and what proportion of funding are you going to send into those particular parts of the countries?
So it's worth saying, first of all, that we have been in a number of places for the last 7 years where we've been doing deep place-based systems change. Now, there's a bit of jargon that probably needs a bit of unpacking. So it's going into an area of community and using the expertise we have within the foundation. Yes, about deploying funding, but ultimately getting different people, all the different actors, all the different people within a community working at a systems level together to unlock funding that might already be in the system, whether that be with local authorities, whether that be with ICB, whether it be working with housing associations, bringing those people together to make a difference in a way that's genuinely community-led. So we've done that in 5 different places where we've brought a little bit of funding, but actually sometimes the funding actually can get in the way in terms of making people work collaboratively. We've done it alongside other funders on something called Local Motion in 6 different communities, and that was bringing much more funding and devolving that power. We have identified a number of pride in place areas. We're looking at about 5 as to those communities, of course, are already getting £20 million, but how can we use some of our expertise and leverage, particularly to centre civil society in the change that's happening within place? So then we've been working with Spring Impact, a consultancy, to help us think about the scaling. And we're using the Good Place Index because, of course, we can get to a much more granular level to understand where are some of those communities that most need our support. And of course, then you could have potentially hundreds, if not thousands of places that you identify. And so we're really then thinking about where can we make the biggest impact given the skills we bring? How can we leverage some of the assets of the bank as well? And where are we being invited in? And where do we think there's most potential? There's no science to that, but there are judgments. And so the team have identified our initial places, which we'll be able to share more in the coming month or so. And indeed, the aim is to bring other funders to that as well. So we're in advanced talks, which I hope to be able to, I can't share that today, Andy, but hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to say a bit more.
So as a grant maker yourself, how easy is it for you to collaborate with other foundations?
I think actually there is a good story to tell here when funders are coming together and making it easier, therefore, not for charities or community-led organisations having to apply to several different routes. But I think there's a lot more we can do. Local Motion is a good example of where we've done that collaboration.
What's that?
Local Motion is where we've actually, alongside 5 other funders, come together to invest in 6 places with one single grant agreement for those 6 places, and then to capture the learning from each other as well. So there are some really good conversations happening around community cohesion at the moment. There's other roundtables I'm involved in around volunteering and what can we do there as well. And a lot of conversations happening around community leadership and how do you invest in local community leaders. And the reality is that we might all have different emphases as different funders, and that's okay. But being aware of what we're all doing to understand where individually we can make the biggest impact is an important role that we have to play as funders. I mean, for someone who's been on the other side of the fence, I know how hard it is. I know how much pressure there are on charities at the moment, and we have a responsibility as funders to make life easier for those organisations who are seeking funding.
You mentioned there that you've worked on both sides of the fence as a charity leader and now as a leader of a funding organisation. How do you think that grant makers are generally managing those reporting requirements that some charities complain about being too onerous?
I think it's variable. On the one hand, it's not for me to say what other funders should be doing, but on the other, I think we've all got a responsibility to share what we think is working and also giving volume to what we hear from charities as well. So the point about unrestricted giving multi-year funding is really important. How do you therefore monitor that impact? Now, interestingly, data AI enables us to start to understand and measure impact in a way that has to move us beyond putting unnecessary burden on organisations and leaders who have got their day job to do, who are already under pressure. And the last thing they want to keep doing is keep reporting back endlessly. So I think one of the things we're trying to explore with the Good Place Index is a lot of this data is publicly available. It's all big data pulled from different data sources that you can start to understand what is going on in a place and how do you take that learning. I mean, ultimately, though, we need enough data to be able to say, are the investments we're making actually making some kind of difference? Now, that's with all the caveats around, how much can you demonstrate attribution as opposed to contribution as a funder or in any theory of change. Certainly my sense is you can't just rely on anecdotal information and that you need to take some sort of data alongside as well. So we're very conscious of that. And I think that point about relational funding is really important because there'll always be a power dynamic. It doesn't matter whether you call yourself a partner or a grantee or whatever. Language helps, but it doesn't remove the ultimate power dynamic. But actually, we're very proud of the fact we have regionally dispersed staff across England and Wales who we've kind of doubled down on in the new strategy and are going through some changes to our structure earlier in the year. What is brilliant about those staff is that they build really strong relationships with the people that we're working with, and that helps improve our understanding. But it means that you're on a level to actually hear from people and actually sometimes be that source of support to those organisations as well, particularly when we've seen such a sort of devastating impact to local voluntary sector infrastructure as well.
And in terms of that application landscape at the moment, what are you seeing broadly in terms of charities approaching you and the volumes of applications that you're seeing?
Well, I mean, if you look at the total picture, we know that there's increasing demand. We also know with many things in life, AI is driving a demand as well. I mean, this is true of trying to recruit at the moment. I've never known the numbers be so high for people applying for roles. And that's partly because I think AI makes it easier for you to apply and quicker. That's true. I think it's different per funder, depending on whether you're doing closed or open funding rounds. And also whether the clearer you are on the expectations, that will help with the inflow of what you're getting as well. But I think there's a kind of bigger story here, which is how do we build more resilience in the system? That's a more difficult conversation to have with the sector, whether that be supporting people who are working on similar causes. And does that mean that that organisation would be better to merge or close a certain function or service? And so we're working with organisations like the Decelerator to help that process. But ultimately, I think the big prize now presented by the change of leadership in this government is how we go after commissioning. And how do we ensure that organisations, social impact organisations, non-profit, are able to properly compete in a commissioning environment in order that they can make a bigger difference to communities. Now, and that could be, whether, as I say, that could be charities, it could be KICs, it could be social enterprise, it could be mutuals, it could be the cooperative movement. But I think there is a moment to seize here as we talk about devolution and place-based change to ensure that we finally confront the fact that commissioning is short-term, it has a preferential treatment often for either people within a system, I'm thinking in particular about health, or where there is a preferential environment for commercial providers. And I think if this moment in time is going to mean anything in terms of shifting power, we should be seeing more money flowing through into civil society organisations. And that isn't going to happen just by us observing it and sort of saying we just need more money. It's going to happen by us making the case to the government at all levels, national, regional and local, that there is a better way to do commissioning.
Now, you are a member of the Civil Society Council, a group of voluntary sector leaders that are part of a group that basically monitors what's happened with the Civil Society Covenant. And you've had a couple of meetings, I think, already at number 10. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit, though, since that was set up, because it was very much a Keir Starmer-led initiative. How optimistic are you that it will continue to be effective, or that it will be effective under the new Andy Burnham regime?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, as you rightly say, there's only been 2 meetings so far. Obviously, before that, we had the Civil Society Summit, which Lloyds Bank Foundation hosted. And I think it's fair to say that's probably the largest ever backing of a cabinet within government that there's probably ever been for the voluntary and community sector and for civil society. I think we had about a quarter of the cabinet, numerous ministers, senior people across government. Now, as you say, it's early days, and we've got to ensure that the rhetoric is then matched with action as well. But the conversations I've had within the last 2 or 3 weeks with people with inside number 10 is that it's very much still a commitment, as I understand it, to the partnerships unit, to the Civil Society Council, to the role of the Covenant. And I'm encouraged by the fact that in Manchester, there are some really good examples of where partnership working has been brought to life. And if I just think about something like Live Well, which is a community-led endeavour about how you really ensure that neighbourhood health works by ensuring that more money is flowing in to the organisations who really are doing health creation. And, we talked earlier about those small charities. I mean, these are the organisations that do health creation every day of the week. because they're bringing people together. They're there for people in the most vulnerable circumstances. They're building relationships with people which are highly trusted. They are stopping demand on GPs. They're stopping demand on acute services. They're giving people a sense of belonging. They're improving their well-being, and they're giving people hope and a route through. This is why you need to invest in it, not for the sake of just saying, well, charities are good, aren't they? So you should give money to them. It's because the work these organisations do lead to better outcomes. Now, we have to design that within the processes of, therefore, how do you do commissioning? How do we ensure that, if you take neighbourhood health as an example, that money is flowing through into community organisations in order that they can make a bigger difference? Because as important as social prescribing is, link workers referring to organisations that are running out of money isn't a sustainable option. In something like health, where there are such vast budgets, if we're really going to seize the opportunity of prevention, money has to flow towards investment in community leadership and community-led organisations.
What's your sense of how the voluntary sector will fare under an Andy Burnham-led government?
I recently read the book that Andy Burnham wrote with Steve Rotherham, Look North. I was quite surprised how little civil society was mentioned within that. But then on the other hand, as I say, I've seen firsthand and close up what has happened in Manchester. And again, where I've seen changes to the commissioning process, where I've seen changes, if you take an approach to housing, how different partners have been brought in a way that is properly joined up. The Greater Manchester Combined Authority gives us a roadmap for what good looks like. And therefore, I am optimistic. But, I would just say to our colleagues in the sector, it isn't just going to happen. And therefore, how we bring evidence to inform practice at all levels of government, how we make the case in a way that we want to be invited into those discussions, and how we ensure that we don't divide amongst ourselves to say, well, charities are better than social enterprises or small organisations are better than large organisations. You need all of these things. That's the strength that we bring. And the key is not for us to look inwards, but to have a movement that's making a case for shifting power to civil society in all its glory.
Can you give listeners a bit of an insight into what it's like walking up the street of number 10 and going into a Civil Society Council meeting in terms of how it works and what it feels like being in there?
Well, I mean, everyone gets distracted by Larry the cat normally as you're making your way in. It's a privilege to be in that space, and therefore you have a responsibility. And I'm kind of conscious of the fact that you're only 12 people, and therefore there have rightly been concerns about what about different groups that aren't in there. It is one route. It's not the route. It's not the primary route. It's one mechanism for how we bring the covenant to life. I think what's interesting about number 10 North is the more I've thought about it, the more excited I get about what you can do in terms of cultural change. Every organisation I've led, it's all about the strength of your culture. And that's true within number 10 as well. And there are some challenges, and this is bigger than civil society, there are some challenges of having a setup which is a street of houses of 300-400 years old, with very long rooms, with very long tables that trigger a set of performative behaviours, I think, when people then do speeches to each other. And I think the idea you'd have a completely new building and a new footprint that can do government differently, that sits alongside digital services as well, I think is really exciting. And I think that's where we need to be turning our heads to, as a sector, to think about what's happening at number 10 North. How are we a central part of that if it's all going to be about devolution? What does that look like in terms of how we can play our role to make the case of we've all got a role here to get better outcomes for everyone in the country, to ensure that everyone's in a good place, that we drive towards those outcomes I described earlier.
I wanted to talk to you about volunteering, because obviously you're one of the co-founders of the Big Help Out, which was founded in 2023 to encourage people to taste volunteering and maybe get involved in the long term. We've just had the figures from this year's Big Help Out, which is slightly unusual because now you've joined forces with the Big Lunch run by the Eden Project. But the figures say that more than 15 million people took part in the Big Help Out or Big Lunch events this year, including 4.9 million who took part in the Big Help Out, 6 million who attended a Big Lunch, and a further 7 million who participated in an event incorporating both activities. So it's difficult to do year-on-year comparisons, but in 2024, the last time a Big Help Out was run on its own, there were about 6.5 million people. How optimistic are you about how this is helping to move the dial on volunteering?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is we are beyond delighted about those numbers. 2024 was a hard year to run the campaign because the general election was called. We had one red risk, which was a general election could be called, and we said, well, that'll never happen, and then it was. So there we go. So this is a year where, as you say, we've done it differently. We've brought it alongside the Big Lunch, so street parties being brought together, bringing people together across divides, breaking bread together, and then how, as part of that, can you unlock the opportunity to say, oh, and while you're here, well, we could do something in our community together to volunteer. It's a very live conversation now. How do we build on that platform? And where do we go now? And how do we link it to some of the other conversations we've been having today? I think what it says to me is there is a latent demand for giving people an excuse to come together. I think the public want this. 2/3 of the public think we're more divided than we were before. Interestingly, those people who are involved in volunteer are much more optimistic. About 2/3 of the people volunteering are much more optimistic about the future as well. I visited that weekend. I went to St. Neots, to an organisation that, as a foundation, we are supporting and partnering with, called Citizen Hubs, run by a very smart guy called Alex Hughes. And St. Neots is a rural market town. On the day, they had engaged hundreds and hundreds of people. Young people who had got involved in volunteering as part of the Big Help Out to help support the day, who hadn't been volunteering before. There was a street party involving hundreds of people down the market square. And they also did something called the Big Listen, which was, how do you engage citizens within that community to start to think about what they wanted to see in St. Neots for the future. Now, I think this gives a bit of a template for what we could do going forward. So how do you go to people on their own terms to give people an excuse to come together, to nudge what I would describe as pro-social behaviours? As a starting point, just meet people that you haven't met before in your community. Start to have a conversation with those people. And then what could you do together to make a difference in your community? Now, some of that will be through community organisations. And, over the 3 years we've run the Big Help Out, we've seen how it does provide a pipeline of people dipping their toe into volunteering or giving time for the first time. Because volunteering, we know, is a word that can turn some people off. If you say, actually, do you mind helping out? You trigger a different set of behaviours. And how do we do that in a way that people feel ownership of within a place, and that they can then come together? And in doing so, you start to move people away from screens, away from their phones, in order that they then spend more time together and make a difference to their community. Now, this desire for people to get more agency, to take control of their area and come together to make it better, I think should be the primary goal of this government, because in doing so, you will build community cohesion, you will get more growth, you will get more of a return to high streets and what that looks like in terms of footfall. Interestingly, when I went to St. Neots, all the local businesses had done different offers to support the day, and guess what? It increased footfall. So I'm not clinging on to the 1970s and 80s that I grew up in, on a small family business in the Fens. But I do think we have a role to ensure that there are community initiatives that get support. And the power of the Big Lunch and the Big Help Out is really, at the end of the day, it's a wrapper, it's a brand that allows you to get into the media to nudge some of those behaviours. What the Eden Project have done as well is given a bit more infrastructure behind us as well. But the Together Coalition have also been very much involved in terms of telling that story. So I think there is something to build out here. Civil society should be at the heart of.
You mentioned nudging people into volunteering there. What lessons can the voluntary sector take broadly from what's been working with the Big Help Out?
Well, I think a lot of charities have been exploring what are the pathways to get people involved in volunteering. How do you develop volunteer opportunities that work around people's lives rather than that just work for you as an organisation? You know, we went through this at the Scouts, and interchangeably was called the volunteer journey and then the volunteer experience. But lots of volunteer-led organisations, those that rely on volunteers, are having to adapt their model to make the ability to engage easier. Now, what does that look like in a time of AI as well? And of course, there's going to be different routes, so what that means in terms of employer-supported volunteering will be different from what it looks like from the journey of someone going onto a AI platform and trying to understand, how do I get involved? And then what does that look like? I think it's a huge opportunity, for example, in terms of young people. Years ago, I was on the board of Step Up to Serve around the I Will campaign, still thriving as a movement. There has to be huge opportunities in terms of volunteering both ways. If you look at some of the challenges we've got, we're getting young people into employment pathways as well. What have we learned from the Big Help Out? Well, talking about volunteering in and of itself is a good thing. Championing the role of that, because we know 1 in 5 people don't volunteer because they've never thought about it. So even just having a presence on BBC Breakfast or The One Show really matters. And we've seen some of this from volunteers over the years, but sometimes I think we've rightly used it to thank and champion people within the sector. But how do we tell that story to the public, to plant the seed, nudge the behaviours just by running a campaign that gives people the excuse? And then the best examples I've seen is when organisations have then tailored bite-sized opportunities to give people the ability to make the first step. When we launched Squirrels at Scouts, this was very much at the forefront of our mind. How do you get someone to come along who had never thought about volunteering, who's a parent helper, and you say to them, oh, do you mind just reading the story at the end of the night? Or just while you're here, could you just help us run that game? And that is the first step you take. And I've seen this with other organisations that we funded as well. The brilliant organisation I remember in Oldham called SORN, whereby women who were victims of domestic abuse or that they had found it difficult to get involved with their community. And one of the first things they would do at the end of the night is to say, oh, do you mind just moving that chair, just help us out? And they would see that as the start of that journey to volunteer. They might not talk about it as volunteering, but it's the start of the journey to go into pro-social behaviours. Years ago, I remember hearing now Sir David Robinson give an example of how he went and took his kids to see a dolphin jumping through a hoop. And he went and goes and talks to the trainer of the dolphin after and says, how do you do that? And the trainer says, I start low and then I do a bit higher and then a bit higher and a bit higher. And I think it's such a great lesson for volunteering, because sometimes our systems and our cultures make people jump through hoops at a very high level. And so we have to adapt our practice to just lower the barriers to participation, to make it easier for people to start a journey that could be the start of a habit for life. Whilst we've had a decade of a decline in volunteering, all the data tells us that. You've reported last week, we've just started to see a potential upturn. I saw this at Scouts where, we were able to get thousands more people involved by changing our provision, particularly on something like squirrels. We've seen it across Parkrun. It can be done, but only if we change the way we've been operating.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, Matt. There's so much more that we could explore.
I don't know. It's gone so quickly.
But Matt Hyde, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, we hope you enjoyed our discussion with Matt, and that's it for this week. Join us next time for a conversation with Jules Lynch, founder and chief executive of the Global Girl Project. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.